Our previous video looked at long-run aggregate supply, and we ended up with a diagram like the one that you can see here, where we have a vertical long-run aggregate supply, which basically is telling us that whatever happens to the price level within the economy, in the long run, that the economy will return to this full employment level of output, and that essentially what's going on there is that the markets will correct themselves. So if there is a surplus of something within the economy, then the price of it will fall, and it will fall until we come back to this this level here. We're going to look more at the dynamics of market equilibrium later on in the course. Now, this that you can see here on the left, this is what is known as the classical long-run aggregate supply curve. And classical refers to an economic school of thought, and this is the economic school of thought. I suppose originally it would be associated with people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the people that really came up with the whole idea of economics as a subject which could be studied, and their initial their initial philosophical views on it tended to be that markets would work efficiently, and if they do work efficiently, as we've just said here, then we will end up with this vertical long-run aggregate supply. So the classical believe in the concept of market efficiency, and if you believe in the concept of market efficiency, then you will end up with a long-run aggregate supply curve which looks like that. So these three ideas are sort of linked. So a classical economist believes in market efficiency, and if you believe in market efficiency, then you have to draw your long-run aggregate supply curve like that. Now, Keynesian economists, on the other hand, don't believe in perfect market efficiency. Now, Keynes is very much associated with his views on the Great Depression, and the Great Depression can't really be explained by the classical long-run aggregate supply curve, because the long-run aggregate supply curve says that the economies of the world should have returned to their full employment level, that they should have returned relatively quickly to that same level of output. So the huge levels of unemployment and so on that we saw during the Great Depression shouldn't have lasted as long as they did, because the prices in the economy should have changed, if you believe in market efficiency, and we would have ended up back at YF again. So if, like Keynes, you saw the Great Depression and you saw a situation where this didn't seem to be working, you needed to come up with a different model. And this alternative model is the Keynesian approach to the long-run aggregate supply curve. And he agreed to an extent with the classical economists that had come before him, in that he argued that there was a point where the economy would hit a limit and it would experience a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, and that point is still full employment. So in that respect, he did agree with the classical economists that have come before him. But what Keynes saw in the Great Depression, and what Keynesian economists have seen in recessions and depressions since, is that actually there is a chance that the markets may not correct themselves for really very long periods of time. So actually the long-run aggregate supply curve isn't vertical along its entire length, as the classical economists would believe, that actually the long-run aggregate supply curve looks more like this. So there is an element of it which is a vertical line, and which corresponds to full employment, but equally there is a bit of it further down here, so kind of to the left of Y1 in this space here, where actually it's possible to have depression, essentially very large levels of unemployment, because essentially the further away we are from this, the higher the level of unemployment will be. Remember, this shows us full employment. So if we're to the left of it, like this, then that means that there are some unemployed resources between these two levels of output which are not being used. And the further left we go, the more and more and more unemployment we actually have. So this area over here to the left is an area which shows mass unemployment, persisting for a very long time, which we refer to as a depression. So what we see is that we can have an economy like this. Don't know what's going on with my arrow there. Where actually what happens is in the long run, we can have a situation where, here we go, got a green arrow, that's how it works. So we've got mass unemployment and depression below this level of output. We then have a period where it's getting gradually harder and harder and harder to increase our output before we hit this vertical limit. So essentially, these are two very different views on the macroeconomy, but they come from this consideration of whether the markets are efficient or not. Classical economists believe that they are. So they believe that markets are efficient and therefore long-run aggregate supply curve looks like that. Keynesian economists do not believe that markets are efficient. And if you don't believe that markets are efficient, then you have to draw your long-run aggregate supply curve like this. Now, it's very important there is no right and wrong approach to this. By definition, we're talking about productive capacity within an economy. And it's very, very hard to measure the capacity within an economy because it's not something actual that you can actually take a quantifiable measure of. You have to look at signals and clues. So I can't see any situation where we will have this debate, this discussion resolved finally, and it is a major difference in terms of economic viewpoint that we will see again and again through the course. So when it comes to using these curves in an exam, you are fine to use either of them. I normally advise my students to use the Keynesian curve, not for any kind of fundamental philosophical view of Keynesianism and so on, but simply for the fact that the element of curvature in it here gives you some evaluation, because you can always talk about it depending on where you are on the long-run aggregate supply curve as to what the overall outcome will be. So a big distinction there. That's just a very brief introduction to it in terms of the long-run aggregate supply curve. You do need to be able to understand both. They could ask you questions on both, but as far as kind of using them in questions to support your answer, you can use whichever you find easier to understand.